Rudy. I'm the Peacemaker-in-Residence at Elizabethtown College. Sometimes I say Peacemaker-in-Residence, because most people go, Peacemaker-in-Residence, you're failing. I have been interested in this topic for many years, and am much more of a practitioner than I am a scholar. And so a lot of my observations will be, I'll try to convey those to you tonight. This title is a little bit of a misnomer. My colleague, Dr. Michael Long, anybody ever heard him speak? He's the other half of the Peace and Conflict Studies minor at the college. And he did something on nonviolence, and I thought, I need to respond in terms of peace building, and I'll explain those terms in a little bit. So I came up with a presentation, and it was right after Valentine's Day. And the title of much of what I use tonight, although I reformulated it, was something about estranged lovers or something like that. Nonviolence and peace building in conversation. So I get to cover both of those terms tonight. And this title, Getting What You Want, you know, we live in a time when people on all sides are pressing for change of some kind. And the research is now emerging that if you want to get what you want to get, the use of nonviolence as a change methodology will get it for you 2 to 3 times more often than if you use some kind of violence to try to achieve that. So you don't have to come at nonviolence with any kind of a deep faith commitment or a value set or anything. You just have to know what you want and then study the methodologies with which to achieve that goal most specifically. I regularly teach in places like Somaliland, Hargeisa, University of Hargeisa in Somaliland in the Horn of Africa. Next month I'm going, for my 19th year, I'm a senior facilitator at the Mindanao Peacebuilding Institute, where I've taught nonviolence. I've taught religion as a source of peace, resource for conflict, and other kinds of courses. So tonight I want to give you a little bit of my own story. We'll look at a few current examples of where nonviolence and, in a larger sense, peace building is at work in the world, some of which you may already know and have never called it that. So if we look just in this decade, we have Occupy, the whole global Occupy movement, 2011 and into 2012. We have the Arab Spring, right? We have the Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong. These are some that you may have seen in the news. Standing Rock for sure, no DAPL, and the South American Indigenous Movement. The one that is happening right before our eyes right now is in the country of Sudan. And women are at the forefront of this. This is one of the, and I'll just kind of put my little asterisks in every now and then, and we'll take bunny trails all over the night. When women lead a nonviolent movement, the chances of it succeeding in its objective are much higher than if men lead the movement. What's happening in Sudan right now is women are at the forefront of this, and they pushed out a long-term dictator. Omar al-Bashir was the president, wanted by the International Criminal Court. This guy couldn't travel to many places because he would have been arrested and prosecuted in the ICC in The Hague. And they succeeded in pushing him out. The military generals close to him took over, and the movement said, no, we want civilian transition government. We don't want a military one. And I think it was just yesterday, a bunch of those guys actually stepped down. We can talk about why that is succeeding in the way it is, or you can ask me a little bit more about that later on. just this month, I would point you to the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict, ICCN, and last time I did ICCN.org, it didn't come up. So it's like international or nonviolentconflict.org or something like that. But they list this month alone India, New Zealand, Dakota nations, Cambodia, China, UK, Palestine, Mexico, Venezuela, Kazakhstan. Those are all nonviolent movements that are in process right now. And so many of them get so little press in this country. The first time that I ever participated in a nonviolent activity, I was living in a refugee camp in the Horn of Africa, in what is now current-day Somaliland. And we had a mud brick wall and a 2-room mud brick house compound in the refugee camp. We were the only Westerners living in that camp, 3,000 people. And one day, the young men of the camp came running, jumping over our wall and hid behind the wall. And we said, "So what's going on?" They said, "Well, the Southern military is here and they're conscripting young men for the army." And that didn't sound right to me. And if any of you know international law, that is strictly forbidden to be recruiting in a refugee camp. So I did something that was probably pretty stupid. I was much younger then. And I walked out to see this thing happening. And of course, I did it alone. Again, there's a lot of rules I broke in terms of nonviolent direct action. But I walked out, and it's only later, as I began to study like nonviolent tactics, that I realized there's a principle at work here. When a third party observes a very volatile situation, it tends to have a blunting effect on violence. And just as you can incite violence by having third parties too, but if the parties are observing and they bring some kind of something to the formula of whatever's happening in terms of the violence, it can have a very much a blunting effect. So as I realized there was something, either I'd read something somewhere or about this observing. The second lesson I learned from that, though, is I went into the United Nations High Commissioner office a couple days later and said, "Do you know what's going on in the camp out there?" And they go, "Yeah, we know. It's nothing we can do." Well, Somalia at the time, 90% of its hard currency and foreign income was coming from refugee aid. So go figure the corruption and the kind of politics that the UN was under then. I started working at the ideas and the concept of peace building then in the mid-90s when I lived in the tiny African kingdom of Swaziland. My wife and I were country representatives from the United Central Committee there for 6 years. And I watched it's one of the few remaining absolute monarchs in the world. The other one is Brunei, I think, or there used to be 3, and then one of them changed. But Swaziland is still an absolute monarch. They do have a parliament, but it's the king can, decree something, and it overrules the parliament. And there was pressing for change from a very, very traditional system to a much more modern, accountable kind of government. And the only force that could do that was the trade union. Now this was back right at the tail end of apartheid, and it was in the changes in South Africa to a majority government there. And so the trade unions in South Africa were very powerful. In next door Swaziland, they were also pushing, exercising their muscles as the only force that could take on a very traditional monarch. And so I began to think, well, how does change come? Nonviolence, as we'll see in a little bit in a definition, is a lot about shifting power. It's a lot about the dynamics of pressing strategic goals. But how do you make changes in a larger sense that are structural in nature? Fast forward then to the aught years, where we spent a majority of that in the Philippines, in Mindanao, on the southern island of Mindanao, and I worked specifically with the issue there on the Moro Islamic Liberation Front as it was fighting the government for autonomy and kind of ancestral domain issues. But the Philippines has a grand and glorious experience of ousting the dictator Marcos, right, in a nonviolent revolution. And this is where I began to start to critique and say, yes, but why are things not changed then? And I realized that nonviolence can have a very strategic objective. And in fact, the more honed it is, like one person who's a dictator you're trying to remove, as soon as that dictator goes, you think to yourself, well, we've achieved what we need to. But in reality, the structures that propped up that dictator also need to be transformed. And in that largest sense, that is where peacebuilding, the field of peacebuilding, comes in to start to look at both the historical context, the governance, economics, and political structures that actually need to be transformed. And so I've been engaged with the Philippines since 2001, make an annual trek back there to teach at the Mindanao Peacebuilding Institute, and I teach nonviolence, and quite often I've started teaching human security there as well. My wife and I lived there for 6 years, and I participated in a lot of civic engagement in supporting the peace process between the government and the Muslim Liberation Front. So let's look at a couple of definitions here. And by the way, just stop me if I'm running over something or going by something too fast, or if you have some questions.
Why were you there? What organization
we were working with Mennonite Central Committee,
Oh, okay.
and so both in Somalia, then in the Swaziland, and then the Philippines. Now I go back, I'm hosted by the organization that brings me back, Mindanao Peacebuilding Institute. And I've done some other training and contract work there as well. So peacebuilding, you know, it's the full spectrum of efforts to achieve just peace. Are you familiar with that word?
No.
It's not in the dictionary yet, but we hope it is soon. So it's, anybody familiar with, in its largest sense, the concept of shalom? The Hebrew word which means all things are well, relationships are in harmony, everybody has what they need. We have a societal capacity to resist violence and those kinds of things. I'm reading a lot into that word. But this concept of just peace means that, you know, some people say you can't have justice without peace, and some people can't say you can't have peace without justice. But I don't think it's an either or. I think the two are synonymous. And as long as there is injustice, people will want to press for change. And the models they have for change involve violence. I mean, it's everywhere, right? Our culture is soaked in that. But what we're learning now is nonviolence as a change modality, which is far, far, far more effective in every spectrum of ways you can think of. Okay? So the full spectrum of efforts to achieve just peace through longer-term constructing and reconstructing social, political, economic damage done by violent conflict. See, this is the problem with violence, right? It destroys the very structures that we need post-conflict. And in fact, if you listen to the brain research right now is informing almost every field out there. And the brain research tells us that if you participate in violence, either as a victim or an offender, in some ways, you end up being as damaged as anybody else. So our participation in violence, you know, does something to our brain chemistry as well. So we acknowledge that there's violence everywhere, and that peacebuilding seeks to kind of bring a full spectrum of activities at all levels, all the way from governance, you know, in political centers and of power, all the way down to grassroots, to community level, where people are trying to repair and rebuild community. Nonviolence, on the other hand, is non-lethal methods to achieve strategic change in the dynamics and structures of power based on pragmatic or principled values. Pragmatic, some of the change, I can cite some examples from the late 90s and early 20th century that are the best models there. But if you look at the civil rights movement, that's a very principled nonviolent movement. So based on a set of values that go deeply into the human being and know our connectedness. Sometimes it's called direct action, sometimes active nonviolence, sometimes nonviolent civil resistance, depending on what the objectives are. So I want to start with some assumptions here, and then maybe we can stop and have a little bit of a conversation. First of all, that all things are connected. The quantum physicists are now telling us that at that level, everything is connected, right? You cannot observe something without impacting it, right? So this is a truism that I picked up when I was in college in the 80s. And I heard it as the title of a speech, and it's stuck with me ever since. And so I'm exploring, well, if all things are connected, how are all things connected? Kind of like a spider web, right? You pull it over here and it wiggles over here, right? Like, how do you do that? The second is the opposite of violence is creation, because I think that the use of violence is it destroys so many of the very things that we're after. And that creates, and again, here we go back to the brain research, that it tells us that it shuts down creative centers of our brain. When we are under high levels of stress or violent stress or you know, the traumatic incidences, the creative centers of our brain shut down. The higher order thinking, and we go back into that reptilian brain that's fight, flight, or freeze. And again, there's brand new research coming out about that third option. We used to think it was just fight or flight. Now we understand that the freeze in those situations is actually the most traumatic thing of all. So when we think about responding to violence with violence, we have extremely limited options. But one of the things I'm discovering is when you respond to violence with nonviolence, you actually have the universe of options that open up to you in terms of creative responses. And I have a spate of slides that show that. We probably won't have time to get there, but I collect examples where people have come up with the craziest and most innovative ways in which to respond to repression, injustice, violence, and almost, you know, every week I'm seeing some picture on social media that goes, whoa, look what these folks figured out here. And subtle energies are the most influential forces in the universe, and nonviolence relies on this principle. Subtle energies. What kind of energy do you think it takes to move oceans? And we're talking hundreds of quintillion tons of water twice a day this far. And yet, none of us, right? Like, you have to really be jacked into the moon or, you know, the time of day or the season in order to understand that the tides are impacted by the moon, and there's a couple other factors here. And yet, day to day, that enormous force all around me is completely invisible to me, unless I'm standing on the seashore and I get my feet wet, right? Or my beach towel gets wet, right? So what is it that we can actually, this enormous well of energy, that if we start to pay attention, that we may actually have an unlimited amount of resources available to us for designing these kinds of changes. And then peacebuilding is reconnecting that, which has been disconnected by some kind of line. So it's a radical understanding of connectedness, and then saying what's broken and how do we fix it? How do we pull things back together? I mean, that's the simple one-sentence definition that after 30 years of this that I have the license to reduce it to. And it's taken me a long time to get there. And of course, it's far more complex than this, and yet I've come to kind of flag that as what I do in peacebuilding. So that first one, all things are connected. Let's just have a look at discussion. How do you think climate change and mass incarceration are related? Because we have an incarceration problem in this country. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. And we incarcerate for stupid things, and people go back into prison for stupid little mistakes, or even legal, bureaucratic issues. And in Pennsylvania, it costs the same amount of money to incarcerate one person for a year as it does to send them to E-Town College. So we've got a problem if we're incarcerating more people than we need to, right? So how are these two connected? Anybody have any thoughts?
They both impact low-income people more
Okay.
than wealthy.
So there's an impact, and it's a demographic, sociological impact, okay?
And there's a lot of denial about both, certainly about climate change, but probably some people that see incarceration as a solution,
Okay.
you know? So
So
this is
follow
a
that.
good thing. What do you mean that's a problem? Yeah.
Yeah. So say more about that, like the connections here, or help her out, anybody? Like,
Well, no, just because, climate change is a huge
Yeah.
part of people's denial that it isn't a problem. It's just something that's fabricated. And I think with the mass incarceration too, as I say, we can see that as a solution. As long as we see, prison as a solution
and
to every single.
what do you have? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I think part of what I think she's saying is driven by the fact that the majority of the population isn't on a day-to-day basis directly affected by either of those two things.
Okay.
It's removed from us. It's kind of almost abstract.
And the opposite of that removal or kind of isolation or compartmentalization, the opposite of that is connectedness, right? Look, if I was going to lose out big time economically because of climate change, I would continue to have people think compartmentally and say, well, this is over there and I am not connected to that. That's what I would do if I was going to try to hoodwink everybody. And so, as soon as we start paying attention to one of these issues, it all leads back to the fact that, wait a minute, this is happening because I'm disconnected, because I feel a sense of disconnected. Now, maybe I'm making a stretch here, but I think that this definition of peace building is reconnecting that which has been disconnected. And so one of the things I tell my students, the classes I teach at E-Town are humanities core classes. And in any given group of 20, 25 students, I'll have 10 or 15 different disciplines. And they're all coming in to learn about peace building, they're all coming in to learn about conflict resolution. And I tell each one of them, each of you can go into your line of work and figure out how to reconnect things. And even if it's two office mates who are fighting with each other or spatting with each other, if you're the peacemaker there, you're actually you're connecting something that's disconnected. And so everybody can participate in this. And you can be the best scientist, you can be the best of a team. Occupational therapist, you can be the best lawyer, whatever. And if you kind of keep this connectivity in mind, you'll be contributing actually to the place we're all trying to go. You know, anybody here drive a Tesla? Anybody here watch the news on SpaceX? Like this guy, Elon Musk, like he is the equivalent of the railroad barons, right? Because the railroad barons connected this country by rails. I have no doubt SpaceX will get us to Mars, maybe even in my lifetime. But here's the problem I have with that. We can do it technically. But are we going to just transport the same crap that we got here in terms of broken relationships? Like every good science fiction book I've written about colonizing Mars, for example, has humans fighting and destroying each other there as we do here. So where is the innovation for how we build resiliency in relationships that resist the urge to that resist the urge to do violence to each other, both individually, right? Because violence exists on an interpersonal level. Like we do violence to each other. We know what that looks like. It's hitting and hurting and it's words. But the violence that's built into our very structures, and here we can talk about maybe what? Exclusion, right? Marginalization. Oh, you're in that group, and so we're going to work to make sure that the rules don't apply to you, that they apply to us. And you know what I mean? Like that's institutionalized, that's structuralized violence. And certainly our culture is saturated with violence. I was in Atlanta at a conference recently with college students, and one of them asked me, yeah, but she said, sometimes it's just necessary to have violence. So what are you going to do about that? And I looked at her and I said, well, what happens if we reframe the idea, and the great nonviolent movements of the 20th century did this, and said, absolutely in our portfolio, violence is not an option. As long as we have the use of violence, I remember this in the first Gulf War. Well, we're going to try diplomatic means, but if we have to, we'll go in there. And it seemed to me that we got in there way too soon. Like have we really exhausted all the diplomatic options? And so, as long as that's in the back of your mind, how do you know when you've exhausted every option? And then get to that point. So, I reframed to the student, I said, what would happen if we would start with the assumption that we will never use violence? Then we would be pushed to find creative solutions. Because I think that's, a lot of times, perhaps politically, that's the easy way out. Okay, I'm getting myself into trouble here, right? Okay?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
We heard a speaker last night, and he was a Republican administration national security official, retired, and he put forth this concept that just blew my mind, that the number of nations, he listed the number of nations that are nuclear powered, that are nuclear weapons, and he said that since we've developed nuclear weapons, they're so terrible that we've reduced the amount of violence. That in World War I and World War II, tens of millions of people died. But since we developed this horrible weapon, we're afraid to use it. What do you think of it? I mean, you blew my mind, and I'm thinking about it, and I'm like, on one hand, if we mess up with one of those, or several of those, it'll destroy everything.
Right.
On the other hand, he has an interesting point. It's kind of stopped, it's so terrible. But how does that have to do with what you're talking about? It seems the opposite.
And it would be easy, right, to attribute this decline in violence, global violence, to the fact that we have nuclear weapons. I think that's a bit of a stretch. I personally believe there's a God because we haven't used them since we actually used them, right? We're still here as a species. which is the best argument, I think, for a higher power that I can ever think of. And I think if you would, there's a guy named Steven Pinker, right? Better Angels, talks about how and he's gone, what is the research, is it 10,000 years old or is it 50,000? I mean, like, as an archaeologist, he's gone back and studied the ancient mass graves, and it's like everybody died of violence back then, and so there is a long-term decline. What would happen if we would frame that to say, actually, we're figuring this out socially, how to do conflict better? Remember, we're not trying to eliminate conflict. We're trying to eliminate the violence that's associated with conflict. Humans will bump into each other all the time. What kind of capacity do we have to transform that into stronger relationships, into more trust, into better communication? And that's the principle of conflict transformation that says, we're always going to have conflict. Bring it on, right? I'm not afraid of it because I know it's an opportunity to understand things better, to understand another person, another nation, right? It's when we use violence that things get really complicated. And the promises of violence really rarely deliver what they promise. And so I think he was attributing some things there that I would want to challenge. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I agree that it's could be more coincidental than anything else. But has there been any research done to look at what kind of things societally we do that are leading to less violence? And my immediate thought was that probably the more effective morals and more effective governmental institutions we have, the less violence.
Any other thoughts there? Yeah.
Well, John, I was just thinking when you're saying about creative ways to handle, violence, it is a given. Well, after just coming back from Asia and living in a Buddhist country, the Buddhists would rather chop their hands off than have face-to-face violence or conflict.
So,
but I mean, after living there, this really changed me, and I know when I was working with the students over there in Saigon, I remember getting mad at my English class and couldn't do the homework, and they said, "Oh, Mr. Bob, why are you angry?" And I crossed the line. It scared them.
Yeah.
Because the violence isn't even on their wavelength.
And if you get to that level, it's actually quite dangerous, right? Because that's where people just really go off the rails.
They all recoiled,
Yeah.
And I realized I crossed the line just in conversation. But then after living there for a while and looking at all the things, there was all these other creative ways to handle things instead of violence. And there's almost no crime there, and there's no violence to speak of. And then I come back here, and we're a very violent society, and that's why we have all the laws and the police and the guns and the way our society has developed over the years. It's us and them. We're over there, everybody's the same, and nobody's better than the next person. And then, like we have a sponsor kid, and we tried to give her a birthday party, and she didn't know how to handle it because we were giving her attention, and she was better than everybody else in the room because it was her birthday, and they don't do that. So it's very interesting. Everybody's kind of
individual.
It's communal thought versus here. I come back here. Everybody's, John Wayne, and private property, and at least a lot of violence.
Yeah. You want to follow up?
There's a strong religious component to what he's talking about, and a very homogeneous kind of situation, and I think that makes a huge difference.
Although Vietnam actually has, 52 minorities or something, so.
56 minority groups,
They've actually experienced quite a bit of
They have.
repression from
You bet.
the dominant group. So, and you look at the Rohingya down in Myanmar and Bangladesh. So, back to your question though, what's different here? we live in a time where we now, this idea about it, all things are connected, we can actually almost wrap our heads around that. And when you think about the problems, let me reframe that. When you think about the challenges facing us, what are the opportunities, right, of climate change? Like nobody's exempt from that. And now we have problems to solve that are global in nature. And unless we can come to a biospheric consciousness, look, we live on a little blue marble, right? And if you've ever seen the pictures from Voyager, and it's this tiny, 1 pixel little blue dot from how many, billion miles away. And it's all there, right? And unless we develop a consciousness, and this is the connectivity piece, that everything in the biosphere matters and has a place. And if you go back to First Nations native cosmologies, that says everything has a voice and deserves a place at the table. I've coined this idea of biopolitical sciences. We have political science, right, that studies the exercise of power among humans in nations. But that's not big enough. It is not adequate. We need a place where the trees and the fire can come to the table and say, do you think that the fires in California are just random things? Do you think that there might be something of the larger biosphere that is attempting to communicate? And if it was, how would we hear it?
Okay, so you're replacing climate religion in place of other religions that have offered that grounding and that singularity in feeling of empathy and so on for other humans, and you're replacing that with empathy for our world as a common binding agent.
Yeah, and you notice how species-centric we are as well. And again, it's wiping out species-centric, like human-centric, right? Like everything we do, and nobody questions that we are like the center of the universe as a species. But guess what? The Earth is just fine without us here if we get wiped out by nukes or whatever it is that takes us off the planet. Mother Earth will continue. So what would happen if we frame that? Whether I call that a religion, I don't know. I mean, that word has a lot of baggage and connotations. I think it's a consciousness. And when I start to make decisions individually and we start to make decisions collectively with the cognizance that we are all connected. I had a really seminal conversation with a friend from Fiji who went out to the elders, and the Chinese actually did some mining out in one of these indigenous areas and just ripped the mountain off, And they had promised and signed agreements that they were going to rehabilitate this area. And the elder told my friend, he said, you see that over there, that rock? They want to plant a tree there. But there was a rock there. And what he was actually saying is that rock had a place. It had, purpose is too strong a word, but it was a part of the whole that's now no longer there because you ripped the mountain out for ore or whatever you got out of the ground. That is indigenous wisdom that says, wow, we are now incomplete because you took that rock away. And you can't replace it with the tree, even though we call that rehabilitation. And I thought, and that's where I started to develop this idea. And it's not alone with me. I mean, I've been reading a lot of things that the consciousness we need to walk through life with is the humility of our species among many. The deep listening that it will take in order to hear like what some of the other things are trying to say. Even if we go to say, look, when you dry out the forest and it starts on fire, it's going to burn homes, right? I mean, there's a kind of a logic there but is there a larger kind of echo to help us remember our place and our connectivity with things which we've long since disconnected. Now, we're way off topic here, but you see, this is the cutting edge of my peace building thinking. How do I teach the younger generations, my students, to be aware of this? Well, you get 5 points if you go out and spend 15 minutes with your hands on a tree. And boy, are they, some of them are self-conscious about that. And try it. And then ask yourself, why? Because there is something immensely powerful I have found by that contact. And the students who actually participate in that come back and they say, oh man. And it's usually during finals week because they need one more five-point assignment. And they come back and they go, oh, I was taken back to my childhood of sitting in trees and climbing trees. Oh, I came away, I was a little bit self-conscious, and then I became so peaceful. And just, because these kids they're just all on their phones, and they're just, they're networked in a way that there's no silence, there's no connection. I'm way off the rails now. I'm way off track. So let's go. Let's keep going. I mean, what are your thoughts? Do you have anything to push back or to add?
Actually, I like what you just said about that there is connectivity with the kids with their devices, but they've lost the connectivity to nature. And so, yeah, I mean, exactly. They're very connected, but not in the way that we'd like to see them.
My brother is off the charts on the artistic side, and he has 70 acres in Kansas, and he's doing land art, he's doing medicine wheels, and deep listening to the land. He introduced me to Grandmother Tree, which is a 1,500-year-old bristlecone pine up on the backside of Pikes Peak. We spent a lot of time there as kids, and there's a stand of bristlecone pine up there, and this one they've done a core sample on it. It's at least 1,500 years old. Now, see, listening to Grandmother Tree is a qualitatively different experience than a maple that somebody planted in their front yard that is disconnected from the rest of the forest. Folks, read the stuff out there about trees and their communication and their resiliency. And can you help us out here with any of these books? There was one by a German arborist. He manages trees, and there's a bunch of them out there as to the wisdom of what trees bring us. Anything to add? Okay, you had your hand up.
Well, I guess I was just going to add, and it ties in a little bit with what you were talking about in terms of, sort of the constant connectivity. And there's sort of two sides to that, I think, right now. And I think as far as the violence in the world, I think both the speed and the range of communication today has, I think, changed the dynamic with violence. So we're seeing more like pockets of violence, which is new, kind of in a way, in terms of, the shootings and those types of things. Okay, but as far as like the mass genocide and those types of things, it's still happening. But, I just finished reading some stuff from the mid-1800s that was a little bit shocking in some ways, that we were still in Europe very archaic in the monarchies. And you talked about the absolute monarchies. Still to some degree that. In the mid-1800s, that's not that far ago, that long ago. And tied to religion in a large degree. And so when we look at like some of the Islamic countries that are fundamentalist driven, and there's a parallel to that, not too distant in our European history.
Yeah.
Right.
That's very much the same, and it's about power struggle.
Yeah.
And so I think that to get away with that kind of governance today, with the communication network that's out there, it can't happen to the same degree. It still happens, but not to the same degree as a couple hundred years ago or thousands of years ago when a despot would drive a population to conflict.
Yeah.
And no one else would know about it outside of that area
Yeah.
for days, weeks, months, years,
Yeah.
or ever.
Yeah.
So I think there's a component there, but there's a flip side that you're talking about, which is
Yeah.
that we become disconnected because of the communication. There's too much communication in some ways at the same time.
Well, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about reframing after your comment, but my brother goes back to say, you know, maybe this youngest generation doesn't get attached to anyone's story because it's scroll. We had 3 networks growing up, right? And if Walter Cronkite said it, it must be the word, right? It must be the truth. And now we have a generation who doesn't get attached to things. Whoa, that's interesting. That's a complete shift. Yeah, go ahead.
You had commented earlier about the third-party observer.
Yeah,
And I think that the communications that we have today
yeah,
are playing that role to a really large extent.
yeah,
And it can be both good and bad,
yeah.
as the gentleman was saying back there.
Yeah.
But I think it really has created a situation where some of these governmental organizations that are being so violent towards their citizens, it
Yeah.
becomes more and more difficult to perpetuate that as the communication gets.
Well, and it's been a major tool in nonviolent revolution, social media, and it's staying innovative ahead of the despots as they shut it down. And you know, there are major think tanks out there that are providing social and electronic tools, social media and electronic tools for nonviolent struggle. And whether it's crowdsourcing and mapping and all kinds of stuff. So it's a fascinating time. Reframing is a tool that I teach in the mediation part, which is actually kind of changed my life because it takes a negative and says, so what do I want here? What's the positive? And one of the things that I think we have to start doing in this country, and I get so sick of NPR. Anybody else listen to NPR here? Any of the news channels go, in a deeply divided nation. Well, like we're 50-50. Isn't that balanced? What would happen if we would reframe a divided nation as a balanced nation? Because 50% is over here, 50% is over there. Would it start our conversations from a different point? So, look, there have been major movements that have reframed the language first and made huge progress. LGBTQ rights in this country, from a legal aspect to a, don't you have a right to be with whoever you want to be with? Again, I don't know where you come out with NRA and gun violence, but we keep telling the NRA and our American public how powerful they are. But look, in this country we spend $500 billion a year responding to gun violence. And they only spend $50 million a year on lobbying. They're not powerful. They're puny. If we would wake up to the fact that we're spending $500 billion a year in direct and indirect costs to gun violence, I mean, just look at, so we start to use different leverage points. And this is nonviolence, and in a larger sense, it's a move toward peace building. Global warming is another major reframing that's happened. We don't hear that much anymore, but we all know the climate is changing, right? Nobody can deny that climate is not what it was when we were growing up as kids. And see, that subtle shift has allowed a different kind of conversation. Still deniers. On the other hand, it shifted. So major social movements have worked on language and figured out, well, look, if this is a sticking point, where do we go? How do we get the conversation going about what's the greater common good? Because in this very balanced nation that we live in, I guarantee you, 99% of Americans care for their kids. All right, I'm not a sociologist, I better retract that. Let the sociologists speak, I don't know how many. But you know, I think that's a talking point. yeah, we care for our kids, we care for our grandkids, we care about their futures. And in a very balanced America, there's something we can talk about, right? But if I'm always told that I'm divided from that person over there, wow, what a profound disconnect. But again, if I was a dictator, this is exactly what I would do, to try to keep my population divided and not thinking that they are connected to anybody else. One of the problems I have with white nationalism, it just doesn't think big enough. Our challenges are, like I say, biospheric in nature, and you want to go off with your little enclave? Come on. You're not thinking big enough. Among other things that I have, problems that I have. So, I mean, well, I'm going to stop there, right? Are we, would you like to see some examples of creative nonviolence in action? I just can run through some slides really quickly here. This guy. Whatever you think about him, he used his power, his position, and now we're all kind of aware of something, whether we resist it or not. And in fact, the pushback on this was to say un-American, whereas he was highlighting an issue that African Americans face in this country. Oh, watch this one here. Let me see if it goes. This is off the German subways, I think. All right? Now, so look, this is kind of a nonviolent tactic. It involves the shame of the perpetrator, right? Not all tactics work in all situations, but the goal here was to stop the violence, and man, was it effective, right? Now watch this one. This one went viral a couple of years ago.
He stood there eating his french fries.
It's called Snack Man, right? He understands this is called interpositioning. You get in the way of violence and it stops. Now, it's not risk-free, right?
No way, yeah.
He could get hurt. On the other hand, the more I show this like, in every class, and the more I look at it, the more his timing was impeccable. Because everybody in the subway in New York knows that when the thing stops and the doors open, everybody moves and shuffles. He took advantage and he moved into that space. So he minimized, because of the situation awareness of everybody involved.
Very subtle, too.
Oh, very subtle.
Speed.
Yes, there he was, you know, and the kinetic violence stopped. It did not. So these are methods with which to get kinetic violence stopped. This is where peacebuilding kicks in and says, look, when the bullets stop flying, literally or figuratively, right? In an office setting, you can have figurative bullets that fly, right? But in my world and much of where I work, real bullets are flying, right? But you can't negotiate. Because almost all of these conflicts in the world end up around a negotiation table. How do we get there sooner rather than later so that the death toll is minimized, right? And so this kind of thing doesn't deal with the structural problems, but it does create the space whereby the larger peace processes efforts can start to move in. Anybody heard of the Nonviolent Peaceforce? I'm going to buzz through these really quick. Okay, look at this. In Turkey, 2013. A lot of frustration. Was it, what was his name, Erdogan? And there was a movement where a lot of people just came out and stood silent. Well, what's a dictator going to do with that? No, you can't stand? I'm going to tear gas you? So, and again, it doesn't really deal with structural issues, but what it does do is it unifies the population and say, hey, I'm not the only one who's frustrated here. And in fact, did you see what we did? we all stood still for a minute. What is it? Is it 5 minutes? And you start to build the kind of community that it takes to then design a movement.
4 hours, it was 4 hours.
Was it 4 hours they
I read
started?
that right.
Okay.
On the right, second paragraph.
Okay.
1800 to 222. So does that, did I read that right? It's a 4 hours?
Let's see, 1800. No, that was more
6
than.
hours.
Yeah.
No, I can't do 1800.
Yeah, that's 6 hours. 6 hours.
6
is
hours.
there. Yeah, yeah. And look at these Quaker grannies, right, in Australia, right in front of some kind of whether it was a detention camp or something where the military was moving in and out, they decided to have tea in front of the gates. And then they all got arrested, right? Like, sometimes people are frustrated, and the easy thing to do, right, is to become violent. But if you're committed to nonviolence, then you say, what do I have to do to satisfy that thing that I spoke up? And, you know, for these grannies, they just decided to have tea in front of the gate, and then the soldiers couldn't come in and out, and then they got arrested. And so, you know, and all of these are designed part of a larger situation. That's a long story. Standing Rock, my gosh. That was a gold mine of things. And as that process up in the Dakota, to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline continued, the tactics evolved. At the very beginning, to stop the bulldozers, they actually put casts on around the equipment, and they were stopped for a whole day. And these folks got arrested, of course, once they got cut loose, but it stopped the operation for a day. And then, you know, it evolved into running skirmishes with nonviolent protesters. And in fact, that had so much press that a kid in Laos, in Southeast Asia, asked President Obama about it, right? So this is the power of harnessing social media and getting the younger people involved, whereby this kid in Laos put Obama on the spot as president of the U.S. and said, what are you doing about this? Wow, powerful stuff, right? And of course, Tahrir Square in Egypt, what kind of a powerful statement, harnessing religion to shut things down, to, you know, because you're out in mass prayer. And then the government is losing moral authority as they start to water cannon people at prayer. So you're harnessing something deep cultural values here. And then certainly the power of women, very strong here. The mothers of some of these soldiers reminding these guys, hey, you know, don't fire in the crowds. You can put your message anywhere, which I just find this fascinating, right? And of course, then you have media that finds the tendrils of the power that's keeping things in place. Here's one, non-lethal sabotage. If you're designing a movement, none of us can sit here and pass judgment on anybody else's movement unless we're part of that and say, what values are we going to bring? What lines are we going to decide we're not going to cross in our nonviolent movement? And then toward the end, the kids were out in the street. And this is the principles of nonviolence, right? Everybody can participate. There's a role for everybody. Not everybody does every role, but in nonviolent movement, you get to decide in designing that movement who takes the risks, the physical risks. And of course, the kids out here, right, the parents, if the soldiers were actively trying to move crowds and shooting into crowds, the kids would be removed immediately. So you get to design this stuff. But, you know, in a war, you want your biggest and strongest soldiers, right? So it's a very selective process, whereas nonviolence, there's a rule for everybody. And you just need to design it such, and then the moral force as well. Around the world, in India, this is in Thailand, splashing blood, a very powerful cultural symbol. In Indonesia, it was symbolic of the president with the derogatory meaning lost to us. In India, with the rights of women and very conservative politicians, they started sending pink underwear to the politicians as a means of protest. And of course, the shoe throwing. And one thing, just like going and standing still at night in a place with a lot of repression, everybody comes up to the roof and bangs pots. Can you bring a dictator down with banging pots? No, but it's part of a larger strategy. Remember, in a heavily violence context, you need to build community if you're going to build a movement. And this is one way to do that. Okay. Oh, the monks here in Ukraine who stood in the freezing cold for 48 hours between soldiers and protesters because they were tapping into the cultural power. And you know, you look at all the brickbats that people were throwing there, and the monks came in there and they just stood, and they kept those two people from tearing each other apart, those two groups, for 48 hours. Again, it's not an end solution, but it is a very powerful way to keep violence from breaking out. All right, I could go on and on, but what time we got here? Am I off? It's 8 o'clock, so here we are. Any last
Just one quick thought is just that sometimes it goes wrong. Tiananmen Square or Kent State, major events,
Right.
but some people lose their lives over. You know, you're there doing the right thing and you're making a statement.
Right.
But you got to be aware that you might give it all up.
Exactly. And you know, a nonviolent movement does not guarantee that the other side won't use violence against you. And count the cost though if two groups would go at each other with throwing bricks or like what is the cost? And then it's random. Then the people affected are random, or as much as you think there's randomness in the universe, right? But in a nonviolent movement, if you were out there and the police are shooting, and you know that that's the possibility, and see, that's the other thing about nonviolence. You do a lot of analysis to figure out, okay, so what are the possible scenarios here? Then you don't put the kids out there. You don't put anybody out in the front lines who is not willing to pay that price. We expect our soldiers to pay the ultimate price. Well, what would happen if we would design a social system that had this, that says, you want to keep violence from breaking out? Sign up. And Nonviolent Peaceforce is the first organization in the world to do that. It's called Unarmed, right now they're doing unarmed civilian protection. In Sudan, in South Sudan, in the Philippines, where else are they working? They're working in about 6 places, and they are highly trained. Sorry?
CPT?
Well, Christian Peacemaker teams is an analogous, but Nonviolent Peaceforce is a-religious. And they're actually working alongside Blue Helmets in some cases. They're working very much with civic groups on the ground who are trying to overcome the violence. Yes?
I used to live in Ireland, and I was, Senator George Mitchell came to college one time, and I asked him, you know, how did he get the Good Friday Agreement stop the violence in Northern Ireland? He said something unusual. He said, well, he said, well, nothing I did. He said, what happened was that the housewives, the mothers, refused to lose another generation of their kids to violence.
Yeah.
And they forced both sides of the table, and then he could then broker the peace from there. So I thought it was a really humble statement on his part, but it was absolutely true.
Yeah.
That the society rose up and said enough, and they defeated the IRA. So I thought that was incredible. His perspective.
This is the one place in the world where they are really managing their conflict until they have enough generations and enough capacities for peace that they can move into the phase that says, nah, we don't want that anymore, and we're gonna actually reframe how we think of ourselves. But right now, there's so much trauma from those years that they are managing the peace. And I don't use that word management very often because I think there are other ways to describe, but I think Northern Ireland might be one of those places.
Well, I hope it keeps going. There was a little trouble this week, but,
Well,
there's been a
Brexit
couple.
hasn't been helping any.
No, that's a mess,
Stresses and-
that's a mess, but,
Yeah.
it'd be interesting to see how that goes. But I lived there for a while, and I had a couple of close encounters myself, that looking back like yourself, I put myself in danger on the border as a student.
Mhm.
Could have gone the other way real easy.
I was just wondering what your thoughts are on Palestine and Israel, because I think the institutional violence of building settlements.
Yeah, exactly.
And what's the answer to that? I mean,
Yeah,
that to me is much more painful, and our own government's, behavior.
yeah.
How do we address those institutional violence?
And that's probably one of the most intractable conflicts on the planet, and it has thousands of years of roots.
I don't think that Netanyahu is the answer, or has the answer.
Well, and I must confess that I don't spend hardly any time there. A lot of people in this area focus on the Middle East, and so I've only been to Iran. I've never been to Israel. I've never been to Jordan or Egypt. I stopped in Egypt a couple of times on the transit, but no, I'm with you there. And one of the things we have to keep in mind, and this is why nonviolence maybe it needs peace building to say, look, we are talking about multiple generations of change here, even if we start today. And it doesn't sound like we're starting today. But so if we're going to design change, what would happen if we put as much money into designing change there as we put into supporting Israel with weapons? Like if we would have a tithe, whatever the military spends anywhere in the world, 10% has to go to peace building. Because I'm telling you right now, peace building has virtually no money compared to, like we spend $750 billion a year in this country on the military, right? And peace building globally has $400 million. And most of that is big bilateral aid. So when you come down to the grassroots communities, we're talking maybe 80 million is spent, or 100 million, compared to 750 billion. What would happen if we would start to spend our money on things like that, supporting the best and the brightest thinkers in our think tanks of designing strategic change that's all inclusive and that's big enough, and if we spent that on diplomacy. We spend money on the things that are our priorities in this country. And is that a depressing answer to
Yeah,
your
right.
open-ended question?
Well, and also that corporate America, I mean, it's all about the money. So
It
making
is.
weapons is very economically.
But again, let's reframe that. Institute for Economics for Peace is telling us that this planet, collectively, and I'm talking humans here, this is species-centric data, we spend $14.6 or $14.3 trillion a year on violence. A year! What would happen if we would harness business? If we would harness finance and commerce to say, that's a lot of waste. What would happen if we reduce the waste spent on violence by 10% next year? That's a goal. We'd free up $1.4 trillion to be injected into the global economy.
And it wouldn't benefit the wealthy.
So military spending is actually it pales in comparison to what the rest of us are paying the bills for. $14 trillion a year. That's mind-boggling. I throw these numbers around, I have no idea what they mean, but I know it's 3 more zeros more than billion. Sorry.
Well,
But we also, you also commented how violence in the world is becoming less and less all the time. And I don't know what the implication of that reality is.
Yeah.
But it sounds like we're headed in the right direction somehow.
Yeah, and so here's what's happening. Anybody heard of social enterprise? Social enterprise, right? It's reframing business to say, if we're gonna make a profit, well, let's make sure that we can reframe the word profit from strictly money to actually a social return on investment. So I'm only gonna take 2% interest, but I want the other 2% to be demonstrated as a social return on investment. The clearest example here is incarceration. $40,000, should we send this person to prison or should we send them to E-Town College? You know what I mean? Like if we can figure out a way to get someone who's broken the law to accountably pay, to make things right, and then take, and by doing so, you've heard of restorative justice? Like, it really lowers recidivism. So I'm a county, and I have $1 million, and I'm spending all that million on incarcerating people. But I come along as a non-government organization to say, I'm going to do restorative justice, and if you give me just 100,000 of that, I will ensure that you save $800,000 in bed space in prisons. And there's an extra 100,000 to do operational. And then I, as an investor, get 100,000 in return. And look, everybody wins there. Like the state is paying only 200,000 for that what was once 1 million.
And that is being done.
Oh yeah, exactly. And I think that answers your question as to why, like, social enterprise is a major part of the shift of consciousness in this around the world, really, I think. But and then we have the statistics that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So I don't know quite how to balance that stuff. But I'm part of the Social Enterprise Institute here as a senior fellow. With my focus is on relationships and it's on peace building. And like with $14 trillion at play a year, let us harness business. Let us harness business to recoup some of that waste and figure out a way to do